Today I'd like to take a look at how we can create standalone functions that we can then reuse in our package, or if we save them to the library, we can reuse them whenever we want. These are really, really useful for things that you reuse a lot. And it saves you if you save it as an external function, you can then go ahead and reuse it whenever. And if we take a quick look before we get started in the library, we can see that there's already a bunch of different functions in here. And if we pull them out, we can see that they have all different kinds of inputs. So this is something that you can set. And then these inputs can be reused. So you can move this same sort of snippet of function into different projects, and because you've set up your inputs in a particular way, then you can go ahead and create new input parameters in whatever graph you've made and reuse them via these function inputs. All of these in the library, if we right click, you can see where their original location is. So these are all things that are part of other Substance packages, whatever those packages may be. But the way the library works, it actually lets you reuse them in your own stuff. So taking a look at the functions folder here is very useful. There's some things that, it saves you a lot of trouble because they've got a lot of nice utilitarian things here that you can just pull out and reuse. With that said, let's go ahead and make a new substance, and we can call this function test. We're not really going to use any of this PBR stuff. I'm just going to get rid of it because we're not really building material, and I'm not going to do anything complicated. This is really more about proof of concept and showing you guys how to do this rather than getting involved in any kind of complicated formulas. So I think what I'm going to do then is we're going to go ahead and make a new function that we're going to put into this package. So I'm going to right click, new substance function, and it's opened up a function graph. So we're now dealing with function nodes and not atomic nodes. And I can right click and rename it, and we'll call this animation timer, and we can save our package and call it function test. Let's deal with this first. In here, I'm going to create something that I want to reuse over and over, and I do a lot of animations, and I'm going to make a variable timer because the $time function here runs per second, and I want to create something that I can plug into any material that I make that I want to animate that's going to kind of just do this little thing for me. I mean, it's only 3 nodes, but you can, if you have something more complicated that you use over and over again, let's say 10 nodes, it'll save you putting those things back together every single time, and you can just reuse it. Now, normally in here, I would create a parameter in whatever graph I'm making, and then I would plug that in here. Because I'm making a standalone function, I have to create an input here that I can then plug in any parameter from any graph that I make and reuse it that way. And if we double click on the graph itself, just like the regular graph, the function graph also has input parameters. And here we can create inputs for the function node itself. So I'm going to call this scale because I want to keep things neutral. I prefer not to put in the word animation here because it's a timer, so it could be used in any kind of timing situation, but I will add a descriptor. So the scale is the $time multiplier. And this will appear on the node itself as information for that, just like here. It'll appear here, and it will remind people what that scale node is specifically for. And then we make a label. In fact, I think I'm going to change this to time scale as far as its identifier goes, because it's more descriptive. And then this is shorter, so I'm going to use that for the entry port. And again, I come in here, I get my variables, get float, and my time scale now appears in the drop-down for my function. And I set this as my output node. And here's the little snippet that we're going to reuse. So nothing complicated. I'm going to come back into my main graph, and now we'll take a look and see how we can use this, guy to start doing things in the main graph. The first thing I want to do is I want to get a bitmap that I could manipulate. I'm going to come into my package again. I'm going to hit link, bitmap, and I'm going to pick up this wheel. It doesn't really matter. We just need an image. And it's created now a resources folder, and it's put that bitmap into the resources folder for me. I'm going to drag it out into my graph, and I'm going to change it to a grayscale. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out this effects map, and I'm going to make it grayscale. And then we'll just plug these guys in. And in order to edit the effects map, I right click and hit edit effects map. This is automatically populated by this quadrant, and we're going to leave it alone. We're actually not going to make any more, well, they're not really instances, any more iterations within this. We're just going to use this very simply as an example of how to get this done. But right now we don't really have an image going on here, and that is because we need to come in here and set the pattern to our input image. And now we can see that what we have as our input is actually showing up here. This function that we made, we can now go ahead and actually apply to any one of these once we've made our input parameter here, which we can go ahead and do now. And we'll call this animation speed now, because here it is specific to animation. And we keep it a float 1, and we can make a label. And the default we could set as 0. Let's make the minimum -1. This way we can animate it in either direction, and we'll make the maximum 1. So we've set up this input parameter, and if we go into our effects map and we come into any of the parameters within our quadrant, we can go ahead and apply this animation timer, for example, to our rotation by making an empty function, clicking on it, dragging our timer in here, and then setting a variable. Setting a variable with this animation speed, which we would just plug into here. However, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something a little bit more elegant. We can achieve exactly the same result, clear this, by putting all of our functions onto this first parameter within the quadrant. And the reason we can do this is because Substance reads these functions in a very particular order. It starts at the top and then it works its way down. So it's always going to get to this color luminosity first. And this applies to any node. I mean, that's just the way that it reads it. So what you can do is you can actually put all your functionality onto this first node and then leave all of these guys clear. And it makes it easier to deal with because you don't have to keep going in and out of all these various little parameters. And you're going to get to learn to do a couple of new things too. So let's come in here and we'll create an empty function. We'll click on this and we're now going to build all of our functionality in this quadrant color luminosity node. We're going to keep things simple. We're going to deal with the pattern offset. And because the reusable function we made is a float 1, we're not going to actually deal with the offset itself. We're just going to deal with how quickly it moves. So this is all just this little animation will apply to the pan. And then the other thing we can do is we can rotate these guys. If we put everything in this first quadrant, we're going to have to send that information where it needs to go, in other words, the pattern offset and the pattern rotation. And we do that by setting variables. So let's begin. First thing we're going to do is we're going to drag in this function that we made. And I'm going to get another variable. And I'm going to now hook it into my animation speed. And this is now acting as our animation timer is now hooked in to the specific animation speed variable for this particular graph. Now, because our pan is actually a float 2 value, we're going to need to swizzle this out to a float 2. So in other words, it's going to take this float 1 and it's going to apply it to the X and the Y values. By the way, you can always switch those out with these drop-down lists. Now, that's great, but how do we send this information out to the place that it actually needs to go? This info needs to go to the pattern offset, but right now we have it sitting in the color luminosity. And the way we do that is we're going to set a variable. Now, the variable set node will accept any result. And what you're doing here is you're saying these calculations in here, the result of what's going on here, I want to be the value of this variable, and I'm now going to give it a name. Now you'll notice there is no drop-down list here. So I have to actually type in my unique identifier. And I'm going to call that pan speed. Because I'm a very clumsy typist, I'm also going to copy this. And you'll see why in a minute. Right now, if we set this, well, we can't even do it because it's not the right, if we set this, it wants a float 1 or a float 4, and this is a float 2, so it's not going to accept this as an output node, and I just want to show you something. If we set this as our output node, our image disappears. And the reason for that is because we're sitting here on this color luminosity, well, in this case, it's a black and white, so it's we're sitting here on this luminosity parameter. And we've just given it a value of 0 because the way our animation timer is built, it's $time times a number, and that timer is set to 0 until you actually start rendering it out. So this result will always be 0. And this luminosity deals with the opacity of our image. So we just set the opacity of our image to 0. And that's the thing about putting functions on this first parameter. You can actually have as many functions as you want in there, but the thing you got to remember is once all of those are done, you need to give it its original information too. And we do this using the sequencer. And the name says it all. This sequences all your functions into the order that you want. And you can actually stack as many of them as you want. And as far as the node, as far as the parameter itself is concerned, it doesn't matter what order you do these in. You do them in the order that you need them to happen. And that doesn't necessarily need to be this order. It doesn't care. This is all about what you need to have happen. The only thing that matters is that the last thing in this sequence needs to be whatever is required for the node that you're piggybacking everything onto. And in this case, I want it to be 1 because I want my image to be opaque. So all I got to do is come down in here and give it the value that I want, and then set this as my output node. And my image has reappeared because the first thing it does when it evaluates this parameter is it runs through this function. Once it's done that, it does the number 1. So right now, this is set to 0. It's not animating, so that's a big fat 0. And then the number 1. And it's happy. Okay, so we've made that not broken, but it still won't animate for us because we haven't actually set the pattern offset to do anything. And now we come in here, we make an empty function, and now this variable that we set in the luminosity, we can come and get it here. So I've highlighted my node, but it doesn't appear on my drop-down list. And set variables won't, and that's why we copied it so that I could paste it in here because I can't type. And then all I need to do is set this as my output node, and we can go ahead and publish this out and see how it looks in Substance Player. So there it is. Our animation speed is appearing on here. If we set the timer going and we move our animation, it works. And we have that function sitting on the luminosity and not on the pattern offset. Now we can stack them too. And if we come back into our effects map, let's go into our rotation and do something about this. So here it's a float 1 because one of these is in turns and the other one is in degrees. And we can continue to do the same thing up in here. This animation speed with our new variable and the function that we made actually is all we really need to do that rotation. And therefore, what we're going to do is just set another variable straight off of this, and we'll call this rotation speed. And again, I'm going to copy it. And then it's really just a matter of adding another control sequence. And, you know, if you have a preference as to which one of these you want to do first, I don't think it really matters in this case. So we'll do this one first. We'll evaluate this one second. And then lastly, we'll evaluate what's needed for this particular parameter once all the functions are done. So we've got our rotation speed, and again, we come back to our effects map. We go into our rotation speed. We'll create an empty function. We'll get that variable, and we'll assign it the rotation speed and set it as the output node. And now, when we look at it in Player, it's going to do both. So that's just a super quick and simple explanation of how you can do this, but it's actually pretty cool because especially when you're dealing with things like effects maps and you've got like a bajillion different parameters that you want to like deal with, it's a lot easier if they're all just neatly stacked up into one function and you know exactly what's going on and it's all in one big spot. So hopefully this is helpful, and there's a million different ways you can apply this information, and you can start saving these snippets to your library so you can just save yourself a whole bunch of time.